Hi, and welcome to this video in the series called Beginnings. My name is Michael Venema, and in the series I'm exploring the opening chapters of the Bible, the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. This is number 10 in the series, and I hope you've been able to look at the earlier videos. Some of what I'm going to say in this one will make a lot more sense if you've seen the previous video. So when you get a chance, if you haven't already, please take a look at them. Thanks so much for joining in. I'm calling this particular video Dangerous Humans. In this video, we're going to take a look at the last few verses of chapter 4 in Genesis, and then all of chapter 5, and a little bit into chapter 6, where we meet someone whose name is very well known, Noah. Well, at the end of chapter 4, things are not looking all that great. We meet Lamech, and Lamech is a real piece of work. He boasts that he has been wounded, and he's retaliated by killing the person who wounded him. So Lamech brings on the tradition of vigilante justice and vengeance in a big way. So things are dark. There are some very dangerous things happening within the human community. In one of my earlier videos, I talk about how, on the one hand, God had tried to quash the tradition of vigilante justice, but Lamech brings it back in a very big way. So, and Lamech sings about it, he brags about it, and this kind of thing. So then we are at the end of chapter 4, and we're all the way into chapter 5, and this is essentially a family tree, an ancestry, a genealogy. It consists of a lot of names, about 10 of them, I think. And these are people with names like Seth and Enosh and Methuselah, who's also very, very well known as being sort of, at least according to the story, the oldest person who's ever lived. These people lived in chapter 5 incredibly long, so 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 plus years, approaching 1,000 years. And typically they would be written up in this way. When Jared was 162 years old, he had Enoch. After he had Enoch, he lived another 800 years, having more sons and daughters. Jared lived a total of 962 years, and he died. So the pattern is, here so-and-so, he lived X number of years until he had his first child. Then he lived so many more years, and this is the total number of years. So these numbers look fantastic to us living in the modern world, maybe to anyone really. A fantastical number of years that these people lived. So what's going on here with these numbers? This is the second thing I want to point out in our reading. So the first one was that human beings have become dangerous. And the second thing I want to think a bit about with you is these numbers. A lot of people have tried to understand what these numbers mean. Do they really mean the actual number of years in which people lived? And I guess I'm just going to say no. And that's because, not just because they're fantastic, but because as far as we can tell, these numbers are a kind of a numerological statement. So the numbers are given not to convey the actual numbers of years that people lived, but they're given to say other things about those people and those times. And we really don't know what they are. The reason that a lot of students and scholars think that these numbers have a kind of a numerology behind them is because the numbers can be connected with numbers like 60, 5, and 7. In one online article on the BioLogos website, you can read that all of the ages can be constructed by using different combinations of the numbers 60, 5, and 7. And those three numbers were very important in the Bible and in ancient Near Eastern cultures. So probably these numbers were constructed using different combinations of a few numbers to provide different meanings, and we really don't know any longer what those meanings are. Nevertheless, I think that the numbers reveal something else. The numbers do state that people lived for a very, very long time, and so from this, what I gather is that even though people have started to do evil, there's a lot of darkness emerging in the world, and even though God has been deeply grieved and offended by what's going on, he can't seem to help himself by continuing to breathe life into people, even for the very long term. And we'll get back to that in a few minutes, because later on in our reading we'll discover God talking about the fact that he's continuing to breathe life into people, which, the way the story unfolds, I think he has to do because people no longer have access to the tree of life that's been blocked off. The path has been blocked off, and so God has to continue to breathe life into people to make us function. So I think there's a cool thing going on here, in that it reveals that even though God is grieved and disappointed, he can't help himself, so to speak, but he continues to breathe life into people for a very long time. And so that kind of symbolically indicates that God continues to be a source of incredible blessing, even though he is grieved and hurt by our sins. So that's the second thing I wanted to bring out in terms of the numbers. The third thing I want to bring out in looking at this genealogy, this list of the patriarchs, as they're often called, is that there is something very interesting going on here. I mentioned Lamech and how things have been taking very dark turns in some areas of the human community. But then we take a break away from Lamech and we go back to Adam, the first man, and sleeping with his wife, the first woman in the biblical story, and she has a son, and she says, God has given me another child in the place of Abel, whom Cain killed, which I talked about in an earlier video. And then Seth had a son named Enosh, and then this whole list of long-lived patriarchs is given. And these are also people of whom it is said that they are beginning to worship the name of the Lord again, and they are beginning to pray. So this is an indication that even though in some quarters of the planet human life has taken very dark turns, God is elsewhere working to make sure that his good purposes are not going to be forever thwarted, but that they will eventually win the day. And that, you could say, is the theme of the entire biblical story from beginning to end, that even though disastrous things have happened, God's grace, God's good purposes, God's good intention for his entire creation, and especially for the human community, are not going to come to nothing, but are ultimately going to be fulfilled and are going to thrive, and one day will thrive without any infringement, by darkness or evil. So this theme begins to emerge very powerfully in this list of ancestors, or this genealogical list with these fantastic ages that each of them lives. That God is, in the meantime, doing something incredible and tremendously hopeful. And maybe you could say it teaches us this literal truth in a mythological way. If that helps you to kind of grasp this may be one good way to look at it. Now, at the end of chapter 5 and at the beginning of chapter 6, we begin the story of Noah. And Noah's story goes on for quite a long time. It is a very, very famous story. It involves the story of the flood and the ark and all these things which you are probably somewhat aware of, even if you're not really connected very much with the stories in the Bible. But most of us have heard of the ark and the flood and Noah and the animals being saved and all of that. So Noah, and I'd have to go back to some of my notes from my student days, but I think that the Noah means the bringer of peace or reconciliation or something like that. I have to look it up again. Maybe the bringer of hope, and hopefully I'll be able to clear that up in the next video. But so we're meeting Noah, and it's got kind of a cool thing, a comment about Noah as soon as we meet him. After Lamech, that's another Lamech, a different one, but after Lamech had Noah, Lamech lived another 595 years. Oh, and this is what I wanted to mention about Noah. Lamech named his son Noah, saying, "This one will give us a break from the hard work of farming the ground that God cursed." Now, this goes back to an earlier story in Genesis, so it looks like there's a lot of hope that Lamech places in Noah, that Noah will be the one to bring on a new day when the earth will bring forth food for us a little more easily than has been the case up to this point in the story. So that is a very interesting thing to think about. But anyway, when we meet Noah, there is even more hope being interjected into the story. Now, this brings us to the beginning of chapter 6, and this is chapter 5 was a bit puzzling, especially for modern people, but I think the beginning of chapter 6 is even more puzzling, and you'll see what I mean as we walk through a few of the lines. And I don't think I have these kinds of issues and this kind of thing totally figured out, but I'll offer what I can, and hopefully it will be a help to you. But it talks about the very first lines about how when the human race had begun to increase, that sons of God had sexual relationship with the daughters of men, and married them. Well, this looks a little bit odd, and people have wondered what that means. Some scholars and students have thought, well, maybe it means the people who are devoted to God and the ones who aren't, and the sons of the different communities and the daughters of the different communities are intermarrying. I'm not sure if that's what it means. Another interpretation is that it's angels interacting with human beings. I'm not sure about that one either. This may harken back, and it may state in a mythological kind of way something that is nevertheless literally true, and that is that in the beginning of the human race there was more traffic between heaven and human beings, even though not everything in the human community was by any means great, but that there was some kind of communication or traffic between the two, and maybe it's stating this in a way that to us seems very mythological. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but perhaps it is. In the next few lines, God says that he's not going to breathe life into human beings forever, but that they will live about 120 years. So that's quite a bit less, from the 900 plus lengths of life that we've been seeing in chapter 5. But nevertheless, it's pretty long by our standards. But I think what's going on here is that we discover that even God, in some way, part of God gets tired, of working with people, because we exhaust him. I'm not sure what that does to our picture of God. Sometimes we think that God is infinite everything, and maybe that's helpful on some levels, and maybe in some real senses that's true, but on another level it looks like even God can get tired of us. So earlier on I mentioned something about God breathing life into people, but he says, no, I'm not going to do that forever. So it's going to be 120 years, and that's it. Okay, so the third thing that we see in this chapter, it says, this was back in the days and later also when there were giants in the land that came from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. And then there's this very interesting sounding line. These were the mighty men of ancient lore, the famous ones. Again, I'm not totally sure what to do with this verse. It's obviously it pulls along a little bit further the story that we saw a few lines earlier on. But this line of the mighty men of ancient lore, the famous ones. I find it very interesting that a lot of people find that the modern world that we have created and that we are continuing to create, even though it's taken some real downward steps here and there, and is really being impacted negatively by COVID-19 as I'm recording this video. But the modern world that we've created, to a lot of people, seems sterile, dull, as if there's something missing. Yes, we've got everything figured out, and at least on a lot of levels, and we can manage so many difficult things in life, and we can all enjoy a lot of prosperity, but there's a kind of an emptiness in some part of our being, and so what do a lot of people do? Well, it's Game of Thrones, it's the old Dungeons and Dragons, or it's Lord of the Rings. It's going back to these stories which are full of myth and legend and superhuman people, full of stories of interaction between unseen powers and the human community, stories full of impressive matriarchs and patriarchs and superhuman men and women who are able to do astounding things. And I wonder if these few verses in chapter 6 bring us into a space where we say, this really is part of what human beings are meant to experience. Life is not just a dry, rational, where we manage all kinds of evils and manage all kinds of pleasures. And life is not just, working in an office cubicle and having your life totally managed, but that there's something else, a deeper dimension to life, which is brought forward, and which I think is evidenced by our desire for these games and these mythological stories that we keep generating amongst ourselves. Maybe maybe these things are expressions of a loss of connectedness with the unseen, the divine, the supernatural, and that life is meant to be a whole lot more richer and interesting than we can currently make it. So maybe that will help you. I think that's an interesting way to look at it, and maybe helps us keep moving forward with the story in the Bible. We're going to go to the story of Noah in the next video, and in the next few lines of Genesis. God says, I'm extremely tired and grieved with the world that I've made, and I've got to make a clean sweep of it. But he thinks that Noah is the new place, the new person with whom to make a fresh start. So let's see how that story unfolds. Thanks so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, to like, to share. I truly appreciate all of that. And again, thanks, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye for now.